Hello, my name is Dr. Ron Traylor, and welcome to History 476, um, quite often known in your catalog as the Age of Compromise. All right, we are going to pick up today uh, pretty much at the end of the War of 1812. War of 1812 ends, the Treaty of Ghent ends the War of 1812 in 1815. And surprisingly, things get back to normal rather quickly. Now, as a matter of fact, after the War of 1812 ended, a new wave of prosperity, a new sense of well being appears. Uh, Many, if not most, Americans supported a balanced economy in this time period, beginning after the War of 1812. A balanced economy that was predicated on equal portions, if you will, of farming, commerce, which is a fancy word for business, and manufacturing. And many historians refer to this as a three legged stool, with the legs being of equal length. Um, Other historians refer to it as the Holy Trinity of economic nationalism. But whatever you call it, um, it made its appearance after the war, into the War of 1812, and Americans be, gradually became aware of the fact that they were better off than they had ever been before. So it seems that things were going great. Well, no, not necessarily. And we'll talk about that. We also need to tell you that uh, out of this period of a balanced economy, economic nationalism, these types of things, came one of the greatest controversies of the time. And we will deal with that controversy and the pieces that make it up uh, as we go on. Let me bring up a rather old topic here, and it's the topic of the Bank of the United States of America. Now, please remember, the bank, the National Bank, Bank of the United States, had been created during George Washington's first term, uh, largely at the urging of Alexander Hamilton, who was Washington's Secretary of the Treasury. And it was Hamilton's goal to create an entity, to create a bank for the United States of America, patterned after the Bank of England. And why not? England had the strongest economy in the world and the strongest financial institutions in the world. And because we know, or you should know by this time, especially if you are a history major or a social studies education major, you should know by now that Hamilton used as his pattern uh, all things English. So the Bank of the United States was created in 1791. Now, there were some limitations on the bank. First of all, the charter for the bank, the charter that legitimized the Bank of the United States, was given by the United States Congress, and it was created for 20 years. At the end of the 20-year period, the Congress would go back to the drawing board. They would reconsider the Bank of the United States. If they continued to agree that it was a great idea, they would recharter it for another 20-year period. And if they didn't like it, they would cancel it. Now, please remember something else is going on here. Uh, I have told you, and if I haven't, let me tell you for the first time, uh, that history does not happen in a vacuum. Everything that happens is affected by everything else that happens. And in no area of American history is this more true. There were unexpected consequences from the creation of the Bank of the United States. Prior to that moment in time, when the Bank of the United States was created, we can generally make an accurate statement. Here's the accurate statement: political parties did not exist in the United States prior to this moment in time. But political parties came into existence because of the debate over the Bank of the United States. And in many ways, it was a debate over how the United States Constitution would be interpreted. Okay, let's talk about real events here. Let's don't talk about theoretical events. Let's talk about real events. Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, was a believer in a broad interpretation of the United States Constitution. In other words, Hamilton really felt that the Constitution should really be used as a guideline to make decisions rather than uh, to check the specifics of the Constitution uh, and determine whether or not a an event was constitutional based on its appearance in the Constitution itself. So there you have Hamilton, who is a strong believer in a loose interpretation of a wide interpretation of the Constitution. The Constitution is a guideline only. Then you have people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who believe that who believe in a narrow interpretation of the Constitution, who believe that the Constitution gives its permission for only those things that are specifically mentioned in the Constitution. Now, armed with just those two facts, the Hamiltonians believing in a wide interpretation, a loose interpretation, and the and Jefferson and Madisonians believing in a very close, very narrow interpretation, you can see that the that it's almost a guarantee that there is going to be an argument based on based on its constitutionality. There's going to be an argument over the approval of the Bank of the United States, and there certainly was. Hamilton and his people. Once again, I cannot stress this often enough. Hamilton and his people believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Therefore, they believed that the creation of the Bank of the United States was entirely constitutional. While Jefferson and Madison, now, it's rather odd that different times in their careers, both Jefferson and Madison agreed that the United States, that the Bank of the United States was a good thing, that it accomplished what Hamilton had wanted it to accomplish. But that had nothing to do with the constitutionality of it. Whether it worked or not was not a part of the question. The only question for them was, is the Bank of the United States constitutional? And how do they judge the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States? Well, they're simple. In the Constitution, is the Bank of the United States mentioned? In the Constitution, does the Constitution give to the Bank of the United States legitimacy? And the answer is no. There's no mention of the Bank of the United States in the Constitution. So, based on that fact, both Jefferson and Madison said that it was unconstitutional. It might have been the finest thing since the invention of sliced bread or the wheel, but that doesn't change the fact that it's unconstitutional. All right. Washington fundamentally agreed with Hamilton's assessment, as did, maybe to a lesser degree, so did John Adams, the second president of the United States. But Thomas Jefferson becomes the president of the United States. He becomes the third president, right? Washington, 2 terms. Adams, 1 term. Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson fights the Bank of the United States, but there's not much he can do about it because it is in existence. It has been approved of by the Congress, and it will exist for at least 20 years, beginning in 1791. However, when James Madison becomes president of the United States, that is the time period when the Bank of the United States is up for reevaluation by the United States Congress. And of course, we know that Madison was opposed on constitutionality terms. Madison was opposed to the existence of the Bank of the United States. And so, when the bank comes up for review, when the bank comes up for renewal in 1811, 20 years, right? It came into existence in 1791. It's now up for review in 1811. That's 20 years. And now Madison is the president. And also, by now, based on the disagreements between those two groups, the Hamiltonians who approve of a loose interpretation, and the Jeffersonians, the Madisonians who approve of a very strict interpretation, the two political parties have come into existence by now. Now, let's talk about them for just a moment. The two parties are the Federalist Party that was created by Hamilton and was led by Hamilton. And the second party was the Republican Party. The Republican Party was, we quite often give Jefferson probably too much credit for creating the Republican Party because he was partnered with James Madison in order to create the Republican Party. So it is entirely accurate to say that both Jefferson and Madison were the founders of the Republican Party. And those two parties have been in existence fundamentally now for 20 years because they really came into existence. They were contemporaries with the creation of the Bank of the United States. Now, in 1811, when the bank comes up for renewal, the political climate has changed considerably because now a different party is in control of the White House. The charter expires in 1811 during Madison's first term. presidents of the United States have a lot of power in the Congress itself. Now, of course, we know that at least theoretically, the three branches of government are separate and equal. But the reality is that presidents can influence outcomes of votes in Congress. And that was the case in 1811. Um, Madison had made no secret of the fact that he opposed renewing the charter of the Bank of the United States. And the reality is that when the vote came up in the Congress, when the recharter vote came up in the Congress, that recharter vote was in fact defeated. Now, I will tell you this that uh, later in his career, Madison came to feel that his opposition against the bank in 1811 was a mistake. And for one of the first times, one of the few times in his life, he freely admitted that error. But that was not going to happen until after the War of 1812 was over. So we're looking at, 6 years down the road. I'm sorry, 4 years down the road before Madison comes to that conclusion. But in 1811, as a result of that vote, the Bank of the United States no longer exists. And without that bank to stabilize United States finances, the nation fell into economic confusion. State banks became more and more common. State banks actually began to issue paper money of their own that had no backing with precious metal. And that paper money became more and more common in the United States. And the economy, as a result, became more and more weak. The lack of the Bank of the United States, the non existence of the Bank of the United States during the War of 1812 made it really difficult for the United States to pursue the War of 1812. We never had enough money to buy the things that our soldiers and our Navy needed. And so uh, here we are, finally, the beginning of our course. The War of 1812 has ended. Uh, Madison is still the president. By this time, he's in his second term. Madison has sort of changed his tune on whether or not to support the bank, the rechartering of the Bank of the United States. And in 1816, the first full year after the end of the War of 1812, the Congress adopted a proposal to create a new Bank of the United States. Uh, but when this happens, pardon me, when the recharter is proposed, all right, I'm sorry for that interruption. All right, in 1816, by the time the War of 1812 was over, Congress adopted a proposal for a new Bank of the United States over the protests of the Republican Party, and oddly enough, over James Madison. We'll talk about that at the appropriate time. Now, by this time, a man by the name of Henry Clay was a member of the United States House of Representatives, and Clay had been elected as the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives. And Clay was an extraordinarily powerful member of Congress. Clay had previously opposed the recharter, but now he sort of switched sides. As a matter of fact, a number of people who had previously opposed the recharter were now in agreement that it should be rechartered. Clay supported the recharter, and he gave a remarkable speech, remarkable for a politician, in that he admitted he had been wrong and that he was changing his mind. He said that a national bank was needed now to correct the chaotic conditions of the United States currency, the weakened condition of the United States currency. And the bill was passed through the Congress. Now, what form did the new Bank of the United States take? Well, it was very similar to the original Bank of the United States. It had a 20-year charter. It was headquartered in the city of Philadelphia. Now, there were branch banks here, there, and yonder all over the country, but the main headquarters for the Bank of the United States was in Philadelphia. The government uh, and private investors continued to partner together, just like they had at the very beginning. The United States government, owned 1/5 of the Bank of the United States stock, which of course means that private investors owned 4/5 of it. And because the government had 1/5 of the stock, they also had the right to name 1/5 of the 25 directors. So 5 of the 25 directors were named by the United States government. The bank made an agreement with the United States government that the bank would keep the government's money in its vaults without charge. Now, it expected certain things in return for this free service. For example, it loaned the government $5 million on demand. Now, in 1816, $5 million was a lot of money. Today, $5 million is just chump change. Now, it's not a chump change at my house, but in terms of government expenses these days, $5 million is really insignificant. But in 1816, that was quite a deal. That was quite an event when the Bank of the United States would loan the United States government $5 million, fundamentally on demand, without really any reasons behind it. Now, also, the Bank of the United States. Now, remember, the Bank of the United States is keeping all the government money in its vaults. Now, what is it doing with that money? It's loaning that money out at interest. So the Bank of the United States is making a nice profit by loaning out the United States funds that are in its bank. And of course, the United States government realizes that's happening. And so another benefit that the United States government gets from the Bank of the United States, in addition to $5 million on demand, every year the Bank of the United States would pay to the United States government a bonus of $1.5 million. So they were making enough profit on loaning the people's money out to where they could then turn right around and pay to the government a bonus of $1.5 million a year. So we had been fortunate to survive the War of 1812 without the Bank of the United States being in existence. Now that the war is over, and now that everyone has an opportunity to sit down and take a deep breath and to reassess what had gone on economically during the War of 1812, enough people, not everyone, but enough people were convinced that of the necessity of the Bank of the United States that in 1816 it was rechartered. Now, let's do the math. It's rechartered in 1816. It has a 20-year lifespan. What does that mean? That means that 20 years from then, it would come up for rechartering again. And what is that year then? 1836, right? 1816 plus 20, 1836. That date is going to loom large in discourse. So you might as well write that date down and circle it and underline it and draw arrows to it because it's going to be very important at some point in this course. Excuse me. I don't know why I have this frog in my throat that I cannot get rid of. Now, it seems that it's been a long time ago since we talked about it, but it's been less than 30 minutes. We said that many Americans supported a balanced economy and that economy was composed of three parts: farming, commerce, which is business, and manufacturing. I also referred to it as a three-legged stool, right? Okay, so we talked about the first leg, and that is the Bank of the United States. So let's talk about the second leg of that stool, and that is the Protective Tariff. Tariff. A tariff is a tax. It's a special kind of tax. Tariff is a tax that is charged on goods that are being imported into your country from wherever they come. Now, during the war, before the War of 1812, and certainly during the War of 1812, um, we had all kinds of problems with the British government and the British economy. We talked about this at length in History 475. The British government, without getting into all of that detail once again, it is enough for us to say that the British government made the attempt of controlling the goods that were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States from not only England, but from other nations of Europe as well. Now, the United States was not a strong manufacturing economy then like it is now. Uh, we we must be aware that just because a thing is a way today doesn't mean that it's always been like that. During the War of 1812, the United States had very little manufacturing output capability. But during the war, when the British Navy blockaded American ports, Americans were forced to make decisions. Of course, one decision that they could have made was to, well, we'll just wait until the war is over, see how it works, see who wins, and then try to get back to normally importing things that we enjoy, the things that we need, the things that we like. And of course, another option was to make the stuff ourselves. And to a degree, that is what we decide to do. If we can't make, let's use some simple example. How about needles and thimbles? The chances are likely that all of the needles and all of the thimbles that were being used by Americans prior to the War of 1812 were made in England, because England was a great industrial power by that time. And when the British Navy blockaded American ports, it meant that the supply of needles and thimbles was cut off 100%. Some Americans decided to start making needles and thimbles for themselves. Uh, they were not willing to do without such what at that time, really, think about it, was really a critical item, a very needed item. Remember, the sewing machine had not been invented yet. All sewing was done by hand. So you needed needles and you need thimbles. So Americans began, especially in New England, Americans begin to make those things that they need for themselves. And of course, our example is needles and thimbles. That shift continued to grow during the War of 1812. When the War of 1812 ended, we mentioned a few moments ago that very quickly uh, things got back to economic normality. Now, the British had been making, let's stick with our example of needles and thimbles. The British had been making needles and thimbles. They had been making them before the War of 1812. They had been making them during the War of 1812. They had been making, and now they were still making them after the War of 1812. They were becoming rather expert at making needles and thimbles. The United States had only been making them for a short time, and they were not experts in it yet. They were still the new guys on the block. But when the war ended, British manufacturers began to send needles and thimbles to the United States, just as they had before the war. And the United States was at an economic disadvantage. Literally, the British could make needles and thimbles in England, ship them across the Atlantic Ocean to America, and sell them in America cheaper than the Americans could make the needles and thimbles right here in America and sell them right here in America. And so it became obvious to the Americans that American manufacturing needed some protections from British, not just British, but especially the British manufacturers. Now, where were most of these needles and thimbles being made in the United States? They were being made in New England. And we know that doesn't surprise us, because we know that the Northeast, which includes New England, has always been a center of manufacturing in the United States. At one time, it was the only place really that manufacturing took place. Now it is spread. There are other areas. New England is still very important, but to New England, we have now added the industrialized Middle West and the industrialized West Coast. But at this time, it was just New England. Now, this whole idea of manufacturing was was still a relatively new idea. Come on, now remember that the United States itself has only been in existence for less than 40 years. And the idea that we need a manufacturing sector is still a relatively new idea. And what is really, really new is the idea that this manufacturing sector needs to be protected from foreign competition. There came into existence a growing patriotic desire on the part of Americans for economic independence from England. Many Americans felt, we needed to uh, have the ability to be self-sufficient and to create those manufactured goods for ourselves that whereas in the past we had depended on those goods from other countries, especially England, we should be working on uh, becoming self-sufficient. And so, in the year 1816, the Congress passes the first protective tariff in the history of the United States. Now, let's be very careful here. I did not say that they passed the first tariff. What I said was they passed the first protective tariff. And there's a huge difference between those two things. The United States had always um, charged tariffs on goods that were being uh, imported into the United States. But the money that was raised for a specific purpose. The money that was raised by these special tariff taxes, and remember, that's what they are. It's a special, unique kind of a tax. That money had been used, for example, to pay the salaries of the inspectors down at the dock who were counting the items that were being brought in from other countries and computing the value of it. In other words, the idea was that the good itself, whatever it was, um, should generate enough income through the tariff to where it would pay all the associated costs of bringing it into the country. And all countries have always done that. That was a tariff, but that was just a regular, everyday garden variety tariff. This is a special tariff. This is a protective tariff. The purpose of this tariff, the main purpose of this tariff, is to make American goods competitive, price competitive with things that are being brought into the country. Let me give you an example of how this would work, of how a protective tariff would work in order to help American manufacturing against foreign manufacturing. All right, let's do this carefully and slowly because I don't have a blackboard to write on or a whiteboard. Here we go. Let's assume for a moment that an American company in Boston um, wants to make boots, and they make a first class boot, and they are able to sell it in the United States. This is not for export. This is strictly for to be sold in the United States. They sell this really good quality boot for $1.50 for a pair of boots. Remember, it's 1816. That's a long time ago. $1.50 is probably a pretty expensive boot in 1816. So the American company uh, uh, sews up and creates this really good boot for sale here. domestic sale for $1.50. There's a problem. The British also are capable of making a really first quality boot. As a matter of fact, they've been doing it longer than the Americans have. The British are able to, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the British are literally, excuse me, they are able to make a first class boot in England that's the exact quality, the same identical quality as that American boot made in Boston. And they're still able to ship it across the ocean and sell it in Boston for $1.25. And the Americans, they simply can't afford to sell it for less than $1.50 or they're going to lose money. So you have the British and the Americans selling a similar boot. The British selling it for $1.25, the Americans selling it for $1.50. If you are an American family who are counting your nickels and your dimes, which boot are you probably going to buy? Well, unless you're a super patriot, right? The chances are likely that you're going to buy the cheaper of the two boots, assuming similar quality. And what does that mean? They're going to buy the British boot. And what does that mean for the American manufacturer? They're going to sell fewer and fewer boots, and if it keeps going like that, they're going to go out of business. So, how do you try to fix that? Well, in this case, the Congress would pass a special protective tariff on the British boot. Now, remember, the American boot is $1.50. The British boot would be sent to America just like it had been doing, except now the special tax, let's say 50 cents for a pair of boots each. Special tax is added to the cost of the British boot. And now, how much does that British boot cost? It cost $1.75, right? It was $1.25. You have a 50-cent tariff on top of it. Now, the British boot costs $1.75, and the American boot still costs $1.50. Now, which boot are you going to buy? Assuming equal quality. Well, of course, you're going to buy the American boot. Now, that is probably an extraordinarily oversimplified example of how protective tariffs work. But in many ways, that's an accurate illustration. How the government steps in, adds a tax to the value of the imported boot in order to help the domestic boot sell more boots and help the company survive. Let me be just as clear as I can be here. In fact, let me repeat myself a little bit. Excuse me once again. The tariff of 1816 was not the first tariff in American history. It was the first protective, and it was designed specifically to protect the United States industry from foreign competition. Now, uh, in the process, it did raise revenue, didn't it? I mean, we're going to increase the price on the British boot by 50 cents. So where does that 50 cents go? Well, it goes into the United States Treasury, which helps the country at large, doesn't it? And the tariff of 1816 received Henry Clay's strong endorsement. Remember Henry Clay? We talked about him with regard to the recharter of the Bank of the United States in the year 1816. Okay, here we are. We're still in 1816, and another issue is coming up, the tariff of 1816. This received Clay's strong endorsement. He said, first of all, that the protective tariff was, in fact, constitutional. He also said, number two, it would free the United States from foreign dependence in a time of war. And that probably is right. The more we could make for ourselves, right, the less dependent we would be on stuff from other countries, especially a strong manufacturing, a strong industrial country like England of that day. Number three, one of the other advantages of the protective tariff, he said, it would it would increase government revenue. That's always a good thing. So, uh, and there were some other advantages that Clay talked about, but generally, Clay, the protective tariff of 1816 received Henry Clay's total support. Now, not everybody liked the tariff of 1816, the protective tariff of 1816. Uh, no matter whether Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, gave his support or not. New England was mostly for the tariff. And that is rather obvious why New England would support the tariff of 1816, because most of the manufacturing in the United States was in New England at that time. The tariff would help the manufacturing, and anything that helped manufacturing in New England was going to get the support of the people of New England. Now, South was mostly against it. Now, you ask yourself, why would the New England states be for the tariff and the Southern states be against the same exact tariff? Well, think about this. There was so little manufacturing going on in the Southern states in 1816 that it's pretty accurate to say that there was none, right? What did exist was so small that it was just a drop in the bucket. What made the Southern states afraid of the protective tariff of 1816? What the Southern states did produce, they produced no manufactured goods, but they did produce a lot of crops. The South was an agricultural economy, and they raised all kinds of stuff, valuable crops, uh, sugar cane, tobacco, indigo, things like that. But the thing that they raised that had the most value was cotton. The gin had been perfected in the late 1790s. Uh, and the cotton gin made it very easy to mechanically remove the cotton seed from the cotton fiber. And when a method of removing the seed from the fiber was created, cotton cultivation just skyrocketed. All over the South, everywhere cotton could be grown, it was grown. And cotton becomes the most commonly exported of all American goods. As a matter of fact, write this one down. This probably will be a surprise for you. It was a surprise for me when I heard it in school all those years ago. It was not until the year 1900 before the value of exported cotton was exceeded by the value of exported manufactured goods. Let me say that again. I need to stress that. It was not until the year 1900 until the value of exported cotton was exceeded by the value of exported manufactured goods. So we've heard cotton referred to as king cotton, and it certainly was. Cotton provided the life's blood of the American economy, uh, fundamentally between the years 1800 and 1900. And it is still today an extraordinarily important crop. Well, the Southerners realized that. Here it is, 1860. The Southerners realized how important uh, cotton is to the American economy. And the Southern cotton farmers are raising all of the cotton they can possibly grow, and they're shipping it all over the world, but they are shipping it especially to England. Now, why? Well, it's very simple. That's where the fabric mills are. Another word for those is a textile mill, Textile, a textile mill. And a textile mill sounds very complicated. It is not. A textile mill is simply a mill that weaves cloth, right? And what is the cloth that's being woven? It's cotton cloth. The English cotton mills are starving for cotton fiber. They can use all of the American cotton that we can send them. It's a good quality cotton. It's cheap cotton. It's exactly what the British mills need. But there's a potential problem here, and the Southerners see it first. Here's a rhetorical question. Here's a what if question. What if the United States puts protective tariffs into place against British goods? Wouldn't the normal reaction by the British be to retaliate against American goods? Right? Tit for tat, right? And how better to retaliate against I'm sorry, how better to retaliate against American goods uh, than to put a protective tariff on the top of the cotton, the American Southern cotton that is being shipped to England? Wouldn't that get the attention of the Americans? Wouldn't that uh, persuade the Americans to do away with the protective tariff on British goods? So the country, the United States, is divided with regard to, are we going to support or are we going to oppose these protective tariffs? And it's pretty much based on region. New England supports it. The Cotton South opposes it. The middle states. Now, what are the middle states? What were they back then? Well, it was fundamentally Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Delaware. Okay, those were pretty much the middle states. Those states supported the tariff. And the states of the old Northwest also supported the tariff. Now, what were the states of the old Northwest? Generally, here they are: Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. Those states that were up on the Great Lakes. And so what happens is that the tariff of 1816 becomes a sectional issue with manufacturers and food growers favoring higher tariffs and planters favoring lower tariffs. All right, that is the That's generally the second leg of that three-legged stool that we've been mentioning. Okay, let's talk about the third leg in the few minutes that we have before this lecture ends. First leg was the Bank of the United States. Second leg, the Protective Tariff that began with the first one in 1816. And the third leg, internal improvement. Now, in the early part of our nation's history, uh, no, let's do it like this. It's easy. If we need to go to Baton Rouge or New Orleans or anywhere, it's easy to jump on an interstate highway and just go there at 70, 75, and 80 miles an hour. I just got back from a Wyoming elk hunt, and much of that trip was on interstate highway, and the speed limit on much of that highway was uh, either 75 or 80 miles an hour. Look, I zipped up to Wyoming. And we've become spoiled. We think that because it's that way today, it's always been like that, and it has not always been like that. In the very first part of our nation's history, we had no roads to speak of. Uh, Towns were lucky to have cobblestoned streets. There was no such thing as a concrete street or an asphalt street. More likely, it was a dirt, muddy street. And even that street ended at the edge of town. I mean, literally, and I'm not making this up. I'm not exaggerating. Literally, quite often at the edge of town, the street stopped and the forest began, just like that. Bridges became the great impediments for movement for American citizens. What do you do when you get to a river and there's no bridge? Well, you either turn around and go back, or some entrepreneur will build a raft and charge you for to be pulled across the river on his raft, right? But still, it's a hassle with no bridges to speak of, no roads to speak of. Um, Transportation was really impeded by the lack of these improvements. As a matter of fact, these improvements quite often refer to them as internal improvement. Today, you quite often see them referred to as infrastructure improvements. It's the same thing, okay? It's the same thing. The War of 1812 highlighted the shortcomings of the of the of the transportation system that existed then. From a strictly military point of view, the lack of roads and bridges made it very difficult, made troop movements from point A to point B very, very difficult. Western settlers, and when I say Western settlers, I mean those people who were living on the western side of the Appalachian Mountains, between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. Western settlers found that if they were that unless they were near a navigable stream, they were pretty much cut off from civilization. Pardon me. They were cut off from trade, and they were limited to a frontier subsistence style lifestyle. Now, that's a good place to stop this first lecture. That's almost an hour, and I try to limit these to about an hour. When we return with lecture two, we will continue. We'll pick up this idea of internal improvements and the need for them. And until then, I'll say goodbye, and I'll see you very soon.